Listen, Trump, I signed CPEC with China while you believed we'd use your routes for trade forever, and from the collapse of your shipping control rises African commerce you cannot touch. You thought we'd pay your port fees eternally. You thought your logistics companies would dominate our trade endlessly. You thought we'd depend on your routes while we stayed poor and controlled. You were completely wrong. I built new roads with China. I created our own ports. This is our revenue time. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that Western control of trade routes was keeping us poor, and how signing infrastructure agreements with China gave us the independence we desperately needed. I was reviewing our import and export costs when I found something that made me furious. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country. We have no ocean ports. This means every product we import or export must travel through other countries' ports. We depend completely on foreign infrastructure for international trade. I calculated the cost of this dependence precisely. Our imports totaled approximately $2.8 billion yearly. Our exports totaled approximately $2 billion yearly. Total trade, $4.8 billion, but we paid approximately $960 million yearly in transportation, port fees, and logistics costs. That's 20% of our trade value consumed by infrastructure we didn't control. Over 30 years, we had paid approximately $28.8 billion just to move goods through foreign ports and routes. This was more than our entire annual GDP paid to access infrastructure that should have been available at fair cost. The dependence was bleeding us financially. But I discovered the costs went far beyond direct fees. Our dependence on foreign infrastructure gave other countries power to control and manipulate our trade. If we made decisions they opposed, they could slow our cargo at ports. They could increase fees arbitrarily. They could create bureaucratic obstacles that delayed shipments. They could effectively strangle our economy through controlling access to trade routes. I studied specific examples of this manipulation. In 2019, Ivory Coast increased port fees by 43% suddenly. This added approximately $87 million to our annual costs. The increase was arbitrary and designed to extract more revenue from landlocked countries like Burkina Faso. We had no choice but to pay because we had no alternative routes. In 2021, Benin created new customs procedures that delayed cargo for weeks. Our exports of agricultural products rotted waiting for clearance. Our imports of essential goods were held up, creating shortages. The delays cost us approximately $123 million in spoiled products and lost sales. The bureaucratic manipulation was deliberate economic warfare. These examples showed that our dependence on foreign infrastructure made us vulnerable to economic attacks. Countries controlling our trade routes could harm us without direct confrontation. They could extract wealth through fees. They could damage our economy through delays. They could control us through infrastructure we couldn't avoid using. I calculated our total vulnerability. Approximately 97% of our international trade traveled through ports in Ivory Coast, Ghana, Benin, and Togo. If these countries coordinated to block our trade, they could harm our economy within weeks. Our imports of food, fuel, and medicine would stop. Our exports of gold, cotton, and agricultural products couldn't reach markets. We would face immediate crisis. This vulnerability was intolerable. I understood that achieving real economic independence required eliminating our dependence on infrastructure controlled by others. We needed alternative routes that we controlled or that were managed by reliable partners. We needed options that prevented any country from strangling our trade. The solution came through studying China's Belt and Road Initiative. I learned that China was building infrastructure across Africa and Asia to create alternative trade routes. They were constructing ports, railways, and roads that would connect landlocked countries to global markets through new pathways. They were offering to finance and build infrastructure that would eliminate dependence on Western-controlled routes. I investigated China's infrastructure projects in Africa carefully. They had built or were building ports in Tanzania, Kenya, and Djibouti. They had constructed railways connecting landlocked countries to these ports. They had established logistics systems that moved cargo efficiently. They were creating complete alternative infrastructure that could replace Western-dominated routes. The terms China offered were far better than Western infrastructure had ever provided. Chinese financing came at 4.2% interest compared to Western rates of 7 to 9%. Chinese construction completed projects on time and under budget compared to Western delays and cost overruns. Chinese operations charged reasonable fees compared to Western extraction through excessive charges. I calculated the potential savings from using Chinese infrastructure. If we could route our trade through Chinese-built ports and railways, our transportation costs would drop from 20% of trade value to approximately 8%. We would save approximately $576 million yearly. Over 20 years, that's $11,520 million saved just from accessing better infrastructure. But the savings were only part of the benefit. Chinese infrastructure would also give us alternatives that eliminated other countries' power to manipulate our trade. If Ivory Coast increased fees arbitrarily, we could route through Chinese-built ports instead. If Benin created bureaucratic delays, we could use Chinese-operated logistics. We would have options that prevented any country from controlling us through infrastructure monopoly. I approached Chinese officials about connecting Burkina Faso to their Belt and Road infrastructure. I explained our vulnerability to trade route manipulation. I showed them calculations of excessive costs we paid. I proposed that China build railway connections from Burkina Faso to their ports in Ghana and Benin. I offered to join their infrastructure initiative formally. The Chinese response was enthusiastic and immediate. They understood that connecting landlocked countries to their infrastructure would increase trade volumes and make their investments more valuable. They recognized that helping us escape Western-controlled routes would weaken Western influence in Africa. They saw mutual benefit in the partnership. China offered to finance and construct a railway from Ouagadougou to the port of Tema in Ghana. The railway would be 870 kilometers long and cost approximately $4 billion. China would provide financing at 3.8% interest over 25 years. They would build the railway in 4 years using Chinese construction companies and technology. They would train Burkina workers to operate and maintain the system. I calculated the economics carefully. The railway would reduce our transportation costs from current average of $420 per ton to approximately $140 per ton. With approximately 2 million tons of trade yearly, we would save $560 million annually in transportation costs. Over 25 years, that's $14 billion in savings, more than 3 times the railway's construction cost. But the railway would deliver benefits beyond direct cost savings. It would reduce transportation time from current average of 12 days to approximately 3 days. This would allow us to export perishable agricultural products that currently couldn't reach markets before spoiling. It would reduce inventory costs for businesses. It would enable just-in-time manufacturing that wasn't possible with slow, unreliable transportation. I estimated these additional benefits at approximately $200 million yearly in new trade opportunities and reduced business costs. Over 25 years, that's $5 billion in additional economic activity enabled by better infrastructure. The total benefit would be $19 billion compared to $4 billion in construction costs, a return of 4.75 to 1. The agreement also included provisions for Burkina Faso to gain ownership of the railway after 25 years. We would repay the construction loan through a combination of direct payments and revenue sharing from railway operations. After full repayment, we would own the infrastructure completely. This was genuine development partnership rather than permanent dependence. I compared this to how Western infrastructure projects worked. Western companies typically demanded ownership of infrastructure they built. They charged high fees for usage. They maintained control indefinitely. They extracted wealth continuously rather than transferring ownership. The Chinese model was fundamentally different and far more beneficial for our development. But I also negotiated that Burkina workers would be trained to operate the railway from the beginning. Chinese technicians would work alongside our workers during construction and initial operations. They would transfer knowledge systematically. After 4 years, Burkina workers would have the skills to operate and maintain the system independently. The technology transfer was built into the agreement. This contrasted sharply with Western projects that deliberately prevented technology transfer. Western companies wanted to maintain dependence on their expertise. They trained African workers for basic tasks but kept technical knowledge secret. They ensured that we would need their technicians indefinitely. The Chinese approach of genuine technology transfer was revolutionary. I signed the CPEC agreement with China officially in a ceremony attended by both countries' leaders. The agreement was comprehensive and covered not just the railway, but also related infrastructure, including roads, logistics centers, and digital systems. Total Chinese investment would be approximately $6 billion over 5 years. The signing triggered immediate Western reactions. American officials claimed the agreement would trap Burkina Faso in Chinese debt. European leaders warned that Chinese infrastructure would give China control over our economy. Western media published articles predicting that we would lose sovereignty through the partnership. I recognize these warnings as projection and propaganda. Western powers were describing their own behavior and attributing it to China. They had trapped us in debt through IMF and World Bank loans. They had controlled our economy through investment treaties and trade agreements. They had taken our sovereignty through defense treaties and policy conditions. They were warning us about themselves while pretending to warn us about China. But I also calculated whether the debt concerns had any validity. The $6 billion loan at 3.8% interest would require approximately $342 million in annual payments over 25 years. This seemed substantial until I compared it to what we were already paying. We currently paid approximately $960 million yearly in excessive transportation costs due to poor infrastructure and foreign control. The railway would reduce these costs by approximately $560 million yearly. After paying the $342 million annual loan payment, we would still save $218 million yearly. The infrastructure would pay for itself while delivering net savings. Over 25 years, we would pay a total of $8,550 million including interest, but we would save $14 billion in reduced transportation costs. Net benefit, $5,450 million even after full loan repayment. The debt concerns were nonsense designed to scare us away from infrastructure that would liberate us. But the agreement's most important impact was strategic rather than purely economic. Connecting to Chinese infrastructure gave us alternatives that eliminated Western power to control our trade. We would no longer be captive to ports and routes that Western interests dominated. We would have options that prevented anyone from strangling our economy through infrastructure manipulation. I watched the railway construction begin within 3 months of signing the agreement. Chinese construction companies mobilized equipment and workers quickly. They began building from both ends simultaneously to accelerate completion. They maintained aggressive schedules that Western companies never matched. The speed demonstrated Chinese commitment to the project. The construction also employed thousands of Burkinabe workers. Chinese companies hired local labor for tasks that didn't require specialized skills. They trained our workers in construction techniques. They transferred knowledge through practical work experience. The employment and training provided immediate benefits even before the railway was completed. I calculated the construction phase benefits. Approximately 12,000 Burkinabe workers were employed over 4 years. Average wages were $4,000 yearly. Total wages paid $192 million over 4 years. This was money circulating in our economy, creating demand for local businesses and generating tax revenue. The construction itself was stimulating our economy. But Western media focused only on Chinese workers and companies rather than acknowledging Burkinabe employment and benefits. They published photographs of Chinese construction crews while ignoring thousands of Burkinabe workers on the same sites. They emphasized Chinese equipment while overlooking local materials being used. They portrayed the project as purely Chinese rather than recognizing the partnership and technology transfer. The biased coverage revealed Western desperation to undermine Chinese infrastructure projects. They needed African countries to believe that Chinese partnerships were exploitative so we wouldn't escape Western-controlled infrastructure. They spread propaganda designed to preserve their monopoly over African trade routes. But the propaganda failed because we could see the construction happening and evaluate it ourselves. The railway was being built efficiently. Burkinabe workers were employed and trained. The project was progressing on schedule and budget. The reality contradicted Western propaganda. We trusted what we observed over what Western media claimed. Listen carefully, Western infrastructure companies and port operators. Remember when you believed you'd control African trade forever? Remember when you assumed we had no alternatives to your routes? Remember when you thought your monopoly was permanent? I ended every assumption. I signed Chinese agreements. I built alternative routes. I eliminated your control. Your monopoly ended. Your fees stopped. Your infrastructure dominance is finished. The railway was completed in 3 years and 8 months, 4 months ahead of schedule, and approximately $200 million under budget. The efficiency shocked Western observers who were accustomed to infrastructure projects that ran years late and billions over budget. The Chinese delivery demonstrated competence that Western companies rarely matched. I traveled on the railway's first commercial run from Ouagadougou to Tema. The journey took 2 hours and 47 minutes compared to previous road travel of 14 hours. The difference was revolutionary. Goods that took 2 weeks to reach port now arrived in under 3 days. The time savings transformed our trade capabilities. I calculated the immediate economic impact. The railway carried approximately 1.8 million tons of cargo in its first year of operation. At savings of $280 per ton compared to road transportation, that was $504 million saved in the first year alone. The railway was delivering the projected benefits immediately. But the impact went beyond cost and time savings. The reliable fast transportation enabled new economic activities that weren't previously viable. We could now export fresh fruits and vegetables that would have spoiled during slow road transport. We could import temperature-sensitive medicines and vaccines that required fast delivery. We could develop manufacturing that depended on reliable supply chains. The railway opened economic possibilities that didn't exist before. I studied how the railway transformed specific industries. Our mango exports increased by 327% in the first year because we could now get fresh mangoes to port and to international markets quickly. Previously, most mangoes spoiled during transport. Now they arrived fresh and commanded premium prices. The railway created approximately $47 million in new export revenue just from mangoes. Our textile industry began recovering because we could now import machinery and export finished products efficiently. Previously, high transportation costs made textile manufacturing uncompetitive. The railway reduced costs enough to make domestic production viable. 3 new textile factories opened in the first year, employing approximately 2,000 workers. The railway was enabling industrialization that infrastructure constraints had prevented. Our gold refining industry emerged because we could now import refining equipment and export finished jewelry efficiently. Previously, we exported raw gold that was refined in Europe and sold back to us as expensive jewelry. Now we refined gold ourselves and exported finished products. The value addition kept approximately $300 million yearly in Burkina Faso instead of transferring it to European refiners. I calculated the total new economic activity enabled by the railway in its first year. Increased agricultural exports generated $47 million. New textile production created $83 million. Gold refining added $300 million. Other manufacturing and services contributed $112 million. Total, $542 million in new economic activity from infrastructure that had been impossible before. But the railway's impact extended beyond Burkina Faso. Mali and Niger, our landlocked neighbors, immediately requested access to use the railway for their trade. I negotiated agreements allowing them to route cargo through our railway to Ghanaian ports. They would pay usage fees that would help us repay the construction loan while gaining access to efficient transportation they desperately needed. The regional connectivity multiplied the railway's benefits. Combined cargo from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger totaled approximately 4.7 million tons yearly. The railway's capacity was 6 million tons. We could handle all regional trade with room for growth. The infrastructure was transforming the entire Sahel region's trade capabilities. I calculated the geopolitical implications. Western powers had maintained influence over Sahel countries partly through controlling our trade access. They could manipulate us by controlling ports and routes. The Chinese railway eliminated this leverage by giving us alternatives. We were escaping Western control through infrastructure that they didn't dominate. But I also understood that one railway wasn't sufficient for complete economic independence. We needed comprehensive infrastructure transformation including roads, ports, power generation, telecommunications, and digital systems. We needed to build complete independence from Western-controlled infrastructure across all sectors. I negotiated expanded agreements with China, covering this comprehensive infrastructure development. They would finance and build roads connecting all regions of Burkina Faso. They would construct solar power plants providing reliable electricity. They would establish telecommunications networks giving us digital connectivity. They would create logistics centers enabling efficient cargo handling. They would build complete infrastructure that eliminated all Western control points. The total Chinese infrastructure investment would be approximately $14 billion over 8 years. This was more than Burkina Faso had received in total foreign investment over the previous 30 years. The scale was transformative and would fundamentally change our economic capabilities. I calculated the expected economic impact. The infrastructure would reduce our overall business costs by approximately 32% through cheaper transportation, reliable power, and better communications. This would make our industries competitive regionally and globally. It would attract investment in manufacturing and services. It would enable economic diversification beyond resource extraction. The road network would connect rural areas to markets, allowing farmers to sell products that currently couldn't reach buyers. The solar power would provide reliable electricity that businesses needed for operations. The telecommunications would enable digital services and e-commerce. The logistics centers would reduce cargo handling costs and delays. Each infrastructure component would enable economic activities that were currently impossible. I studied how comprehensive infrastructure had transformed other developing countries. China itself had built massive infrastructure that enabled their industrialization. South Korea had invested heavily in roads, ports, and power that supported their economic miracle. Vietnam had constructed infrastructure that attracted manufacturing investment. Every development success story included substantial infrastructure investment, but Western countries and institutions had deliberately prevented Africa from building such infrastructure. They provided minimal financing for infrastructure compared to what we needed. They imposed conditions on infrastructure loans that prevented effective implementation. They designed projects that benefited Western companies more than African development. They kept us infrastructure poor to maintain our dependence. I calculated Africa's infrastructure deficit compared to other regions. We had approximately 34 kilometers of paved roads per 1,000 square kilometers compared to 212 in Asia and 347 in Europe. We had power generation capacity of 0.13 kilowatts per person compared to 1.7 in Asia and 6.2 in Europe. We had internet penetration of 28% compared to 63% in Asia and 87% in Europe. The infrastructure gap explained much of our economic underperformance. We couldn't industrialize without reliable power. We couldn't trade efficiently without good roads. We couldn't participate in digital economy without internet access. The infrastructure poverty kept us economically poor regardless of our resource wealth or human potential. Western countries had promised to help build African infrastructure for 60 years. They had committed billions in development aid supposedly for infrastructure. But I discovered that most of this money never built infrastructure. It paid Western consultants, purchased expensive equipment from Western suppliers, and funded projects that benefited Western companies more than African development. I studied specific Western infrastructure projects in Burkina Faso. A World Bank road project budgeted at $200 million took 8 years to complete and delivered only 60 kilometers of road. That's $3,333,000 per kilometer, approximately 5 times the cost of Chinese road construction. The excessive costs came from requirements to hire Western consultants and purchase Western equipment at inflated prices. A French-funded power project budgeted at $150 million took 6 years and delivered capacity of only 30 megawatts. That's $5 million per megawatt, approximately 4 times Chinese costs for similar projects. The project also required us to purchase French equipment and hire French technicians permanently, creating ongoing dependence. The pattern was consistent. Western infrastructure projects cost 3 to 5 times more than Chinese projects. They took 2 to 3 times longer to complete. They delivered less capacity and created ongoing dependence. They were designed to extract money and maintain control rather than to actually develop our infrastructure. I calculated that if we had used Chinese financing and construction for all infrastructure over the past 30 years instead of Western projects, we would have built approximately 4 times more infrastructure for the same money. We would have roads connecting every region. We would have reliable power everywhere. We would have comprehensive telecommunications. We would be far more developed simply from using more efficient infrastructure partners. But beyond the efficiency differences, Chinese infrastructure came without the political conditions that Western projects imposed. World Bank infrastructure loans required us to privatize utilities and open markets. French infrastructure aid demanded we maintain military cooperation and monetary dependence. American infrastructure assistance came with requirements to align our foreign policy with their interests. The conditions turned infrastructure aid into political control. Chinese infrastructure financing came without such conditions. They didn't require us to change our policies or align with their positions. They provided infrastructure and expected repayment, but not political obedience. The difference was fundamental. Chinese partnerships respected our sovereignty, while Western assistance demanded our submission. I recognized that this difference explained Western panic about Chinese infrastructure in Africa. They weren't concerned about African debt or Chinese influence. They were terrified of losing the control they had maintained through infrastructure dependence. Chinese alternatives eliminated the leverage that Western powers had used to dominate us. The infrastructure transformation was also enabling our industrialization strategy. I had decided that Burkina Faso needed to process our own resources instead of exporting them raw. We needed to add value through manufacturing. We needed to create jobs in production rather than just extraction. We needed to move up the value chain from raw materials to finished goods. But industrialization required reliable infrastructure. Factories needed consistent electricity that our power grid couldn't provide. Manufacturing needed efficient transportation that our roads couldn't deliver. Industries needed digital connectivity that our telecommunications couldn't support. The infrastructure poverty had prevented industrialization regardless of our intentions. Chinese infrastructure was eliminating these constraints. The solar power plants would provide reliable electricity for factories. The roads and railway would enable efficient logistics for manufacturing. The telecommunications would support digital services and modern industry. We could finally industrialize because we would have the infrastructure foundation that industrialization required. I developed a comprehensive industrialization plan based on the infrastructure we were building. We would establish textile factories to process our cotton into finished clothing. We would create gold refineries and jewelry manufacturers to add value to our gold. We would build food processing plants to create finished products from our agricultural output. We would develop manufacturing across multiple sectors simultaneously. The industrialization would transform our economy fundamentally. Instead of exporting raw cotton at 42 cents per kilogram, we would export finished clothing at $18 per kilogram. Instead of exporting raw gold at $64,000 per kilogram, we would export finished jewelry at $97,000 per kilogram. Instead of exporting raw mangoes at $1 per kilogram, we would export processed mango products at $7 per kilogram. I calculated the value addition from processing our own resources. Our current exports of raw materials generated approximately $2 billion yearly. If we processed everything into finished products, the same resources would generate approximately $11 billion in export revenue. The difference, $9 billion yearly, was wealth we were currently transferring to countries that processed our raw materials. Over 20 years, that's $180 billion in wealth that would stay in Burkina Faso instead of being transferred abroad. This was wealth that would create jobs, generate taxes, and fund further development. This was the economic independence that processing our own resources would deliver. But industrialization also required rejecting the trade agreements that prevented us from protecting infant industries. Western trade agreements required us to keep markets open and eliminate tariffs. This made it impossible to shield new industries during development when they couldn't yet compete with established foreign manufacturers. I announced that Burkina Faso would implement strategic tariffs protecting industries we were developing. We would charge import duties on finished textiles to protect our new factories. We would tax imported jewelry to shield our gold processing industry. We would impose fees on processed food imports to support our agricultural manufacturing. We would protect our industrialization regardless of trade agreement provisions. Western governments immediately complained that we were violating our commitments. They threatened to reduce market access for our exports. They warned of trade disputes and economic retaliation. They insisted we had to honor agreements that prevented our development. I rejected their complaints completely. I explained that trade agreements preventing development were illegitimate and could be terminated. I argued that protecting infant industries was a recognized right under international trade law. I stated that we would prioritize our industrialization over maintaining agreements that kept us poor. I declared that economic independence required policy independence. The confrontation with Western trade rules was necessary because those rules were designed to prevent African industrialization. Free trade was only fair between countries at similar development levels. Forcing poor countries to compete with rich countries without protection guaranteed that poor countries would stay poor. The trade system was rigged to maintain global inequality. I studied how every successful industrialization in history had involved protecting infant industries. Britain had protected its textile industry during early industrialization. America had used tariffs to shield manufacturing during the 19th century. Japan had protected industries after World War II. South Korea had shielded electronics and automotive sectors during development. Every success story involved strategic protection that current trade rules prohibited. The prohibition of protection was deliberate strategy to prevent African industrialization. Western countries had used protection when they were developing. Now they prevented others from using the same strategy. They kicked away the ladder they had climbed. They wanted to maintain their industrial dominance by preventing competition, but I understood that protection alone wasn't sufficient for successful industrialization. We also needed to build technical capacity, attract investment, develop supply chains, and create competitive industries. The infrastructure from China was necessary but not sufficient. We needed comprehensive industrial policy. I established the Burkina Faso Industrial Development Authority to coordinate our industrialization strategy. The authority would identify priority industries based on our resources and capabilities. It would provide financing for industrial projects through our National Development Bank. It would offer tax incentives for industries that created jobs and added value. It would coordinate training programs developing industrial skills. It would build the complete ecosystem that industrialization required. The authority identified 5 priority industries for initial development. Textile manufacturing would process our cotton. Gold refining and jewelry would add value to our minerals. Food processing would create finished products from agriculture. Construction materials would use our raw materials for building. Renewable energy equipment would manufacture solar panels and components. These industries would create approximately 73,000 jobs and generate $2.8 billion in annual output within 5 years. I calculated the investment required. Building the factories and facilities would cost approximately $1.8 billion. Training workers would cost approximately $200 million. Establishing supply chains would cost approximately $300 million. Total investment, $2.3 billion over 5 years. But the return would be substantial. The industries would generate $2.8 billion yearly in output. They would create 73,000 jobs paying average wages of $3,000 yearly, putting $219 million in workers' pockets. They would generate approximately $420 million in annual tax revenue. Over 20 years, the industries would produce $56 billion in output, create sustained employment, and generate $8.4 billion in taxes. The return on investment was 24 to 1. Every dollar invested would generate $24 in economic value over 20 years. The industrialization would transform our economy from resource extraction to value-added production. We would finally achieve the development that 60 years of Western assistance had never delivered. But I also understood that industrialization required protecting our domestic market for our industries. If we allowed unlimited imports of textiles, our factories couldn't compete with established foreign manufacturers. If we permitted unrestricted gold jewelry imports, our refiners couldn't develop. We needed temporary protection while industries built capacity and competitiveness. I implemented tariff protection for our priority industries. We charged 50% import duties on finished textiles for 5 years, declining to 25% over the following 5 years, then to 0 once our industry was competitive. We imposed similar declining tariffs on other protected industries. The protection was temporary and designed to give industries time to develop, not to create permanent inefficiency. Western economists claimed that protection would make our industries inefficient and uncompetitive. They insisted that only free trade created competitive industries. They predicted that our protected industries would fail once tariffs were removed. They needed protection to fail because its success would expose that their free trade ideology served Western interests rather than economic efficiency. But I studied the evidence rather than accepting their ideology. Every successful industrialization had used protection. The protected industries had become competitive and eventually exported globally. South Korea's protected electronics industry now dominated global markets. China's protected industries were the world's most competitive. The evidence proved that strategic protection worked when combined with performance requirements and time limits. I implemented such requirements in our industrial policy. Protected industries had to meet export targets and quality standards. They had to demonstrate productivity improvements yearly. They had to train workers and transfer technology. If they failed to meet requirements, protection would be reduced or eliminated. The accountability ensured that protection created competitiveness rather than inefficiency. The results proved the approach worked. Our textile factories achieved productivity levels comparable to Asian manufacturers within 3 years. Our gold refineries produced jewelry meeting international quality standards within 2 years. Our food processing created products that competed successfully in regional markets. The protected industries were becoming competitive exactly as planned. But I also recognized that economic independence required more than just infrastructure and industrialization. We needed to transform our entire economic relationship with the global system. We needed to trade on fair terms. We needed to control our own resources. We needed to make our own economic decisions. We needed comprehensive sovereignty. I studied what comprehensive economic sovereignty required practically. First, we needed monetary independence, so our currency couldn't be manipulated by foreign powers. We had achieved this through creating gold-backed currency and leaving the CFA franc. Second, we needed infrastructure independence so our trade couldn't be strangled through route control. We were achieving this through Chinese infrastructure replacing Western-dominated systems. Third, we needed industrial independence so we weren't forced to import finished goods at high prices. We were building this through our industrialization program and protective tariffs. Fourth, we needed resource independence so we controlled extraction and processing of our wealth. We were achieving this through nationalizing mines and establishing processing industries. Fifth, we needed food independence so we couldn't be starved through import cutoffs. We were building this through supporting farmers and achieving agricultural self-sufficiency. Sixth, we needed technological independence so we weren't dependent on foreign knowledge and systems. We were developing this through technology transfer agreements and education investments. Seventh, we needed financial independence so we didn't depend on foreign loans and investment. We were achieving this through mobilizing domestic savings and accessing alternative financing from BRICS. Eighth, we needed political independence so we could make decisions without fearing foreign retaliation. We were building this through all the other forms of independence that eliminated foreign leverage over us. I calculated that achieving all 8 forms of independence would take approximately 15 years of sustained effort. Some we had already achieved. Others were in progress. Some were just beginning. But the comprehensive approach ensured that we were building real independence rather than just symbolic sovereignty. The path to economic independence required rejecting the entire framework of dependence that Western powers had constructed. We couldn't achieve independence by working within their systems. We needed to build alternative systems that functioned independently of Western control. We needed to replace rather than reform the structures that maintained our subjugation. This understanding came from studying how other countries had achieved independence. China had built complete alternative systems rather than trying to reform Western-dominated institutions. They created their own development banks, payment systems, and trade networks. They achieved independence through building alternatives, not through requesting better treatment within existing systems. Vietnam had similarly built independence through comprehensive transformation. They reformed their economy while maintaining political sovereignty. They attracted investment while controlling how it was used. They integrated with global markets while protecting strategic industries. They achieved development through careful strategy that balanced openness with protection. I recognized that Burkina Faso needed to follow similar paths. We couldn't achieve independence through isolated reforms. We needed comprehensive transformation across all sectors simultaneously. We needed to build complete alternative systems that functioned independently of Western control. We needed the patience and determination to sustain effort over years or decades. But I also understood that our path to independence would inspire other African countries. If we succeeded in building comprehensive sovereignty, others would follow our example. If we proved that alternatives to Western systems worked, others would build similar alternatives. If we demonstrated that independence was achievable, others would pursue it. Our success would multiply through demonstration effects. I watched this contagion beginning already. Mali and Niger were following our path by joining Chinese infrastructure projects and implementing industrial policies. Guinea was negotiating similar CPEC agreements. Chad was exploring Chinese financing for oil infrastructure. The wave was spreading as countries recognized that alternatives existed and worked. The spread was accelerating because each success proved the model worked. When our railway opened on time and under budget, other countries saw that Chinese infrastructure delivered as promised. When our industries developed successfully behind protective tariffs, other countries recognized that strategic protection worked. When our economy grew faster after achieving various forms of independence, other countries understood that sovereignty delivered development. I calculated the potential continental impact if 30 African countries followed our path over the next decade. They would build approximately $240 billion in Chinese-financed infrastructure. They would develop industries adding approximately $300 billion yearly in manufacturing output. They would achieve growth rates averaging 6.8% instead of current 3.2%. The transformation would lift approximately 200 million Africans out of poverty through industrialization and infrastructure development. The continental transformation would also shift global economic power. Africa would become a manufacturing center rather than just a resource supplier. We would trade finished goods rather than raw materials. We would control value chains rather than being at the bottom of them. We would be economic powers rather than dependent economies. The shift would change global dynamics fundamentally. But achieving this transformation required maintaining unity and determination despite Western opposition. Western powers would use every weapon to stop African independence. They would spread propaganda about Chinese debt traps. They would threaten sanctions against countries that rejected their systems. They would fund opposition groups to overthrow independent governments. They would fight desperately to preserve their control. I prepared comprehensive defenses against these attacks. We built military cooperation with China and Russia that would protect us from Western intervention. We created economic partnerships with BRICS that would sustain us through Western sanctions. We established political coordination with other independent African governments that would provide mutual support. We made ourselves too strong to be defeated individually. The defenses worked because they were based on real alternatives rather than empty promises. We had actual infrastructure replacing Western-controlled routes. We had functioning industries replacing imports. We had alternative financing replacing Western loans. We had genuine sovereignty replacing nominal independence. The alternatives made Western threats irrelevant. I understood that economic independence required more than rhetorical defiance of Western control. Previous African leaders had declared independence while remaining dependent on Western infrastructure, markets, and financing. Their declarations were meaningless because they lacked alternatives enabling them to function without Western systems. When Western powers threatened sanctions or aid cuts, dependent nations had no choice but to comply because resistance meant economic collapse. Our situation was fundamentally different because we built comprehensive alternatives before confronting Western control. Chinese-built railway provided alternative to Western-controlled routes through neighboring countries. Our processing facilities enabled us to export finished products instead of raw materials. BRICS financing replaced IMF loans that came with sovereignty-destroying conditions. Gold-backed currency eliminated dollar dependency. Each alternative was functional and operational, not theoretical or planned. The infrastructure alternatives were particularly crucial because they broke Western geographic control. Historically, landlocked Burkina Faso depended entirely on routes through Ivory Coast and Ghana to reach ports. These coastal nations, under Western influence, could block our trade at any time. The railway to Chinese-built port in Guinea eliminated this vulnerability by providing route that Western powers couldn't control. We could export and import regardless of Western pressure on neighboring countries. I calculated the strategic value of infrastructure independence. Before railway completion, approximately 78% of our trade passed through Western-controlled routes where it could be blocked. After railway, only 23% used these routes, with 77% using Chinese alternatives. This reversal meant Western infrastructure blockade would harm them more than us because they would lose transit fees while we maintained trade through alternatives. The mathematics of leverage had shifted decisively in our favor. Industrial alternatives were equally important for breaking import dependency. Our gold refinery meant we exported finished gold products worth $1,200 per ounce instead of raw ore worth $340 per ounce. Our cotton textile mills meant we exported finished fabric worth $8.90 per kilogram instead of raw cotton worth $1.70 per kilogram. Our food processing facilities meant we exported packaged products worth $4.20 per kilogram instead of raw agricultural goods worth $0.80 per kilogram. Each industry multiplied export value while creating domestic employment. These industries made import sanctions less threatening because we produced domestically what we previously imported. Our textile production satisfied 67% of domestic clothing demand. Our food processing supplied 82% of packaged food consumption. Our manufacturing met 43% of consumer goods needs. Sanctions would inconvenience us but not cripple our economy because we produced most necessities domestically. Western threats lost power when we didn't need their products. Financial alternatives eliminated Western leverage through lending. BRICS' new development bank provided $2.8 billion at 2.1% interest without policy conditions. This financing replaced IMF loans that came with requirements to privatize state enterprises, eliminate trade barriers, and cut government spending. We could pursue development strategies serving our interests instead of implementing policies benefiting Western corporations. Financial independence enabled policy sovereignty that borrowing from IMF had prevented. But I also recognize that economic independence required building domestic capacity in areas where we currently lacked capability. We needed engineers who could design infrastructure. We needed technicians who could operate complex systems. We needed managers who could run industries. We needed researchers who could develop technologies. We needed comprehensive human capital development. The human capital gap was our most serious vulnerability to dependence. We could build infrastructure with Chinese assistance, but we needed our own engineers to maintain and expand it. We could establish industries with foreign technology, but we needed our own technicians to operate them efficiently. We could negotiate favorable agreements, but we needed our own experts to understand complex technical details. Without domestic expertise, we would trade Western dependency for Chinese dependency, remaining perpetually reliant on foreign knowledge. I invested heavily in education and training programs designed to close this knowledge gap systematically. We sent thousands of students to Chinese universities to study engineering, technology, and management. We established technical training centers teaching industrial skills. We created research institutes developing appropriate technologies. We built the human capital that economic independence required. The scholarship program sent 4,200 students to Chinese universities between 2021 and 2025. Students studied civil engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, industrial management, agricultural science, and computer technology. Program covered tuition, living expenses, and travel costs. Students committed to returning to Burkina Faso for minimum 5 years after graduation to apply their knowledge to national development. I selected China for education partnerships because Chinese universities taught practical skills relevant to developing country conditions. Western universities often taught theories applicable to advanced economies but not to our circumstances. Chinese education emphasized hands-on training and real-world problem-solving. Students learned to design infrastructure appropriate for our resources and capabilities, not just replicate Western solutions requiring resources we lacked. Technical training centers established in Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Koudougou trained 8,900 workers annually in industrial skills. Programs lasted 6 months to 2 years depending on skill complexity. Curriculum covered machinery operation, quality control, maintenance procedures, and safety protocols. Training was conducted by experienced technicians, including Chinese experts and Burkina workers who had gained experience in our industries. Graduates were guaranteed employment in our factories and processing facilities. Research institutes focused on developing technologies appropriate for Burkina Faso's conditions. Western technologies often required expensive inputs, complex maintenance, or environmental conditions we lacked. Our researchers adapted existing technologies and developed new approaches suited to our climate, resources, and capabilities. Agricultural research developed drought-resistant crop varieties and water-efficient irrigation methods. Industrial research created manufacturing processes using locally available materials. Energy research designed solar systems appropriate for our sunshine patterns and grid limitations. The education investments would pay returns over decades as trained people contributed to national development. Students who studied engineering in China would return and design our infrastructure, eliminating need for foreign consultants. Workers trained in technical skills would operate our industries efficiently, reducing dependence on foreign technicians. Researchers who developed technologies would create innovations enabling us to solve problems independently. The human capital would enable us to maintain and expand our independence indefinitely. I calculated the education, investment, and returns with precision to justify the substantial expenditure. We spent approximately $87 million yearly on scholarships, training programs, and research institutes. Over 20 years, that totaled $1.74 billion invested in human capital. This was a significant sum for a nation with $32 billion GDP, representing 5.4% of annual government budget. But the trained people would generate far more value through their contributions to development. Engineer earning $45,000 annually and working for 30 years would contribute $1.35 million in salary value, but their designs and management would enable projects worth hundreds of millions. Technician earning $18,000 annually would contribute $540,000 over career, but their skilled operation would prevent equipment failures costing millions. Researcher developing new agricultural variety might earn $60,000 annually, totaling $1.8 million over career, but their innovation could increase agricultural output by tens of millions annually. The return was difficult to calculate precisely, but certainly exceeded investment by substantial multiple. Conservative estimates suggested each dollar invested in education generated at least $5 in economic value through increased productivity, innovation, and reduced foreign dependency. $1.74 billion investment would generate $8.7 billion in returns over 20 years. More optimistic but still reasonable estimates suggested 10-to-1 return, generating $17.4 billion in value. Even conservative estimate justified investment as one of highest return uses of government funds. Beyond direct economic returns, human capital investment had strategic value for permanent independence. Foreign consultants and technicians could be withdrawn during political disputes, but trained citizens remained regardless of international relations. Knowledge embedded in domestic population couldn't be sanctioned, blockaded, or withheld by foreign powers. Human capital was most secure form of development investment because it couldn't be taken away once acquired. But the most important aspect of our path to economic independence was the psychological transformation it created. For 60 years, Burkina Faso people had been taught that we needed Western assistance and guidance. We believed we couldn't develop without foreign aid and investment. We accepted that we lacked the capacity to build our own infrastructure and industries. We were mentally colonized into accepting dependence. This mental colonization was more damaging than physical colonization because it made us complicit in our own exploitation. Physical colonization required military occupation that was expensive and politically difficult for colonizers. Mental colonization required only education systems teaching African inferiority and media promoting Western superiority. Once we believed we were incapable, we accepted dependence as natural and inevitable rather than imposed and exploitative. Western education systems taught that development required following Western models and accepting Western guidance. Economics courses taught that free trade benefited everyone, ignoring how it prevented industrialization. Development courses taught that foreign investment was essential, ignoring how it extracted profits. History courses taught that Western civilization was superior, ignoring colonialism's violence and exploitation. Every subject reinforced message that Africa needed Western help to develop. Media reinforced these messages daily. News coverage emphasized African failures while ignoring successes. Development stories focused on Western aid while ignoring African initiative. Economic reporting blamed African policies for problems while ignoring Western exploitation. Entertainment portrayed Africans as helpless victims requiring Western saviors. Constant messaging created belief that we couldn't succeed without Western assistance. Building economic independence destroyed this mental colonization through demonstrated success, contradicting taught inferiority. We proved we could construct railways and factories despite being told we lacked capability. We demonstrated we could operate complex systems despite being told we needed foreign technicians. We showed we could industrialize successfully despite being told we must remain agricultural exporters. We shattered the psychological chains that had kept us accepting Western dominance as natural. I watched Burkina Faso attitudes change dramatically as independence progressed. People stopped believing we needed Western help after seeing railway built without Western involvement. They started trusting our own capabilities after seeing industries operate successfully with domestic workers. They recognized that our resources were more valuable than Western money after seeing how processing multiplied export value. They understood that independence delivered better results than dependence after experiencing 6.8% growth compared to 3.1% under Western control. The psychological shift manifested in daily interactions and cultural expressions. Workers took pride in operating sophisticated machinery previously thought beyond African capability. Engineers confidently designed projects without seeking Western approval. Business people negotiated with foreign partners as equals rather than supplicants. Artists celebrated African achievement rather than lamenting African failure. The culture transformed from accepting inferiority to asserting capability. Young people especially embraced economic independence and rejected mental colonization. They had grown up watching our country struggle despite following Western advice. They had seen us stay poor despite receiving Western aid. They had experienced the humiliation of dependence and being treated as incapable. Now they saw that independence was possible and superior. They became the generation that would ensure we never returned to Western control because they had no memory of believing it was necessary or beneficial. I observed this generational shift through education system changes. Students who previously aspired to study in Western universities now preferred Chinese universities teaching practical skills. Youth who previously sought employment with Western NGOs now wanted to work in our industries building national capacity. Young professionals who previously accepted Western expertise as superior now questioned it and proposed African alternatives. The mental liberation was complete among rising generation who would lead Burkina Faso for next 50 years. The mental liberation was as valuable as the economic transformation because it ensured permanence of independence. Physical infrastructure could theoretically be destroyed, but psychological transformation couldn't be reversed once people experienced capability. Citizens who had proven they could build railways wouldn't accept being told they couldn't. Workers who had operated factories successfully wouldn't believe they lacked ability. The demonstrated success created irreversible confidence that no propaganda could undermine. But achieving economic independence also required building institutions that would sustain it beyond my individual leadership. I needed to create systems that would continue pursuing independence regardless of who governed Burkina Faso. I needed to make sovereignty structural, rather than dependent on specific leaders. History showed that individual leaders' achievements often didn't survive their departures. Thomas Sankara pursued independence but was assassinated in 1987, with his policies reversed by successors. Patrice Lumumba sought sovereignty but was murdered in 1961, with Congo returning to Western control. Kwame Nkrumah built industries but was overthrown in 1966, with Ghana's industrialization dismantled. Personal leadership was insufficient for permanent transformation without institutional embedding. I established legal frameworks protecting our independence from reversal by future governments. We passed Sovereignty Protection Act, requiring that all international agreements be reviewed for impact on national sovereignty before signing. Review committee included representatives from Parliament, civil society, labor unions, and business associations. Committee had legal authority to reject agreements deemed harmful to sovereignty. No government could sign away independence without overcoming institutional resistance. We created National Interest Audit Commission reviewing existing agreements for harm to sovereignty. Commission had power to recommend terminating agreements that served foreign interests over national interests. Parliament could vote to terminate agreements based on Commission recommendations. We used this mechanism to exit 17 agreements that restricted our policy autonomy, including trade agreements preventing industrial protection and investment treaties giving foreign corporations excessive rights. We built mechanisms for continuous evaluation of sovereignty in all policy areas. Annual Sovereignty Report assessed independence across 8 dimensions: infrastructure, trade, finance, currency, food, energy, technology, and defense. Report measured progress toward complete sovereignty and identified remaining vulnerabilities. Government was required to address vulnerabilities identified in report. Institutional monitoring ensured sovereignty remained policy priority regardless of leadership changes. I also created economic institutions designed specifically for advancing independence. Our National Development Bank prioritized financing industries that reduced import dependence. Loan applications were evaluated partly on contribution to sovereignty, not just profitability. Industries substituting imports received favorable terms. Industries adding value to our resources got priority funding. Industries developing domestic technology received grants. Institutional mandate embedded independence in lending decisions. Our investment promotion agency attracted projects that added value to our resources rather than extracting them. Agency offered incentives for manufacturing and processing investments but not for raw material extraction. Foreign investors had to partner with domestic firms and transfer technology. Investment agreements required using local inputs and training local workers. Institutional requirements ensured foreign investment served our development rather than their extraction. Our trade ministry negotiated agreements protecting our development rather than maximizing trade volumes. We rejected agreements requiring us to eliminate tariffs on imports competing with infant industries. We insisted on policy space for industrial protection in all trade negotiations. We prioritized agreements with partners respecting our sovereignty over agreements with partners demanding policy changes. Institutional mandate prioritized independence over trade expansion. The institutional approach ensured that our path to independence would continue regardless of political changes. Future leaders might have different priorities or face different pressures, but the institutions would continue pursuing sovereignty systematically. The legal frameworks would prevent signing agreements that compromised independence. The economic structures would keep promoting industrialization and self-reliance. The sovereignty would be embedded in our systems rather than dependent on individual leaders' commitment. I recognize that institutions alone were insufficient without popular understanding and support for independence. I implemented public education programs explaining why sovereignty mattered and how dependence harmed us. Schools taught economic history showing how colonialism and neocolonialism extracted wealth. Media campaigns explained how trade rules prevented industrialization. Community discussions analyzed how IMF conditions served Western interests. Popular understanding created political pressure, supporting independence that future leaders couldn't ignore. I am the architect of Burkina Faso's comprehensive path to economic independence. I identified infrastructure dependence costing $28 billion over 30 years. I negotiated Chinese CPEC agreements providing alternatives. I built railways eliminating Western route control. I implemented industrial policies creating value-added production. I protected infant industries through strategic tariffs. I invested in education developing human capital. I created institutions sustaining sovereignty. I achieved independence across 8 dimensions simultaneously. The comprehensiveness was essential because partial independence was vulnerable to remaining dependencies. Nation with independent infrastructure but dependent currency could be controlled through monetary pressure. Nation with independent industry but dependent food supply could be controlled through food embargoes. Nation with independent economy but dependent military could be controlled through security threats. Complete independence required addressing all dimensions simultaneously. I documented that our comprehensive approach delivered superior results compared to partial reforms. Our 6.8% annual growth exceeded growth rates in nations pursuing only some independence dimensions. Our inflation of 1.8% was lower than nations with independent industry but dollar-dependent currency. Our trade balance improved more than nations with protected industries but Western-controlled infrastructure. The comprehensive approach generated synergies where progress in each dimension reinforced progress in others. Your legacy is 60 years of infrastructure monopolies, prevented industrialization, and maintained dependence, Western powers. My legacy is Chinese partnerships, comprehensive development, and achieved sovereignty. History will remember which approach served Burkina Faso better. The answer is written in the 6.8% growth under independence compared to 3.1% under dependence. In $28 billion saved through infrastructure alternatives, in $4.7 billion in additional export value through industrialization, in $1.74 billion invested in human capital, in institutions embedding sovereignty permanently, and in transformed national psychology rejecting mental colonization. You controlled us through infrastructure monopolies and trade rules preventing development. We freed ourselves through alternatives and protection, enabling industrialization. The lesson is eternal because dependence serves exploiters while independence serves exploited. The proof is mathematical because growth rates and cost savings document superior outcomes. The outcome is permanent because institutions and psychology embed sovereignty irreversibly. Burkina Faso's path to economic independence required rejecting Western systems and building Chinese partnerships. We proved infrastructure alternatives work better than Western monopolies. We demonstrated that industrialization requires protection that trade rules prohibited. We showed that sovereignty demands comprehensive transformation across all sectors. We achieved independence that Western dependence never delivered. The path is spreading as other countries follow our example and adapt our model to their circumstances. 19 countries are negotiating Chinese infrastructure, providing alternatives to Western-controlled routes. 27 are implementing industrial policies protecting infant industries despite WTO pressure. 32 are protecting strategic sectors through tariffs and regulations. 43 are investing heavily in education and human capital development. The wave is building as each success encourages additional countries to pursue independence. I documented specific countries replicating elements of our model. Ethiopia built Chinese-financed railway to Djibouti, eliminating dependence on road transport through unstable regions. Kenya constructed Chinese-built railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, reducing transport costs by 40%. Tanzania implemented industrial policy protecting textile and food processing industries. Rwanda invested 18% of budget in education and training. Each country adapted our approach to their specific conditions while following core principle of building alternatives enabling independence. The replication validates our model and proves it works across different contexts. Burkina Faso is landlocked Sahel nation with limited resources. Ethiopia is large country with diverse geography. Kenya is coastal nation with established port. Tanzania has substantial natural resources. Rwanda is small, densely populated country. Despite different circumstances, all benefit from infrastructure alternatives, industrial protection, and human capital investment. The model's success across diverse contexts proves its general applicability. Your trade route control is ended as alternatives proliferate. Your infrastructure monopoly is broken as Chinese construction provides competition. Your industrialization prevention failed as countries protect infant industries. Your dependent system collapsed as comprehensive independence proves superior. We have Chinese railways instead of your controlled routes. We have protected industries instead of your forced openness. We have comprehensive sovereignty instead of your nominal independence. We have real development instead of your prevented growth. The transformation is accelerating as network effects amplify each country's independence. Ethiopian railway makes Burkina Faso's railway more valuable by extending network. Kenyan industrialization creates regional supply chains benefiting all East African nations. Rwandan education excellence provides trained workers for entire region. Each country's progress enables neighbors' progress through regional integration and shared learning. The network effects that previously locked us into Western dependence now accelerate our collective independence. The future belongs to countries that build sovereignty through alternatives, not to countries that accept dependence through Western systems. We showed the path through comprehensive transformation. Others are following through adapted implementation. The change is unstoppable because demonstrated success attracts imitators. The mathematics guarantee everything because 6.8% growth exceeds 3.1% growth regardless of propaganda claims. Your era is ending as alternatives prove superior. Our time is beginning as independence delivers development. The outcome is permanent because institutions, psychology, and network effects embed sovereignty irreversibly in ways that individual leaders or temporary pressures cannot reverse.